Chapter 34. Darien and Rostam. The moon wasn't full, but it still glowed enough in its waning gibbous phase to cast a decent amount of light across the waters of the Petaluma Slough. With no other man-made lighting, the moon seemed almost brighter as its dull rays danced on the shimmering surface of the slough's murky waters. Darien sat in the center of the boat as it raced through the slough. Rostam wrenched back and forth as needed on the outboard engine's steering handle, guiding the boat through the narrow, winding channels. Their hair blew back, and their eyes watered as the wind rushed at them. The boat was making pretty good time, 20 knots, maybe better, as they approached the first of two major hazards along their route, the East Washington Street and D Street bridges. After that, the brothers would be home free, they hoped. The tide was mostly in, so the water in the slough was deep and easy to move through without fear of hitting an underwater obstacle. The last thing either wanted was to be unseated by a submerged log or some other piece of debris. As they approached Washington Street, they cast their eyes up toward the street, but were unable to see the looming figure of the APC they knew was parked overhead. For a split second, the noise of the boat changed as they passed under the low bridge, and then rocketed out the southern side to the sounds of rifle shots. Both brothers ducked lower in the boat, unable to do anything else but stay low and keep the boat running flat out. When no sounds of rounds impacting the boat reached their ears, they both assumed their plan was working. Mike and Manny were set up to cover the Bayet brothers' approach in the event any of the KPA soldiers were out of the APC and ready to place accurate fire on the speeding boat. The Bayets didn't know where the men were set up at, but the KPA soldiers must have dismounted and then been fired on by Mike and Manny, which accounted for the rifle fire, none of it incoming. Either way, the boat flashed through the narrow channel, then rounded a bend and was out of the KPA soldiers' line of sight within 10 seconds. The brothers would have preferred a reprieve for at least a few minutes, but D Street lay less than 45 seconds from Washington Street, leaving them no time to contemplate possibilities. There were only two potentials: motor through and live, or be shot and die in the brackish waters of the Petaluma Slough. Cam and Tim were set up at D Street, watching the APC assigned to control the bridge. The vehicles sat idling, but all the soldiers were buttoned up inside the armored beast. Cam heard the gunfire from Washington Street and could tell his people and the other team were the only men firing. The KPA soldiers never got off a shot, but the disturbance alerted the men below them. Cam and Tim were in the same parking garage Mike had used in their prior engagement. He hadn't wanted to use it, but the design was perfect with its heavy concrete construction and an exterior stairwell on the back side they used to move into position and would use when they fled the area. Cam had painstakingly checked the stairs for booby traps as they moved their way into the structure, surprised when he didn't find any. If he'd been the party ambushed from the structure, he'd have made damn sure the entire parking garage was rigged with explosives for the next yahoo who wanted to use it as a fortified shooting platform. The back hatch on the APC cracked open, but no one leapt out. They were being cautious after having lost so many men recently. Tim leveled his M4 at the vehicle and fired 3 quick shots at the open hatch. The rounds pinged off the thick metal door, and the door swung closed just as the boat came careening past, leaving a white, frothy wake that turned to dark, muddy ripples as the boat powered on into the darkness. "Let's get out of here," Tim hissed, getting to his feet and sprinting in a crouch across the open parking structure. As the Bayets passed under the D Street bridge, Darien glanced back and up just in time to see a shower of sparks erupt off the back of the APC parked at the bridge's edge. "Geez," he thought, turning back to keep an eye out for any debris they may run into. With the boat hidden along the slough, the pieces were in place for everyone to move out in different directions with vastly different intentions. Cam had begrudgingly agreed to assist in getting the boat into play, but made it clear to everyone he was leaving just as soon as Darien returned. Rostam would ferry Mike, Tim, and their prisoner out to Sacramento while Alex and Manny waited behind, collecting as much intel as possible without getting themselves killed. It wasn't the greatest plan, but it was the plan they were going with. Tim told the group the prisoner must have been of great interest to the task force in Nevada because they were sending gunships and would have air cover as well. It was a funny thing with governments. Much of the time they struggled balancing their budgets, but there were those rare times they truly wanted to get something done and were able to move heaven and earth to do it. Cam sat on his cot. No weapon to clean or gear to pack. All that was done. Now he waited for Darian to return so he could leave. He hadn't wanted to come to this damn state in the first place, and now that he was here, he found himself right back in the middle of a situation he swore he'd never take part in again. After leaving the Marine Corps, he'd made a promise to himself that he would never serve another man. While he was in the Middle East, he hadn't given much thought past the fact that his leadership in Washington said there were bad guys there, and he was doing his country a service by fighting and serving. It was the old, if we don't fight them there, we'll be fighting them here at home speech that every warfighter had heard a million times. After returning home, he had a lot of time to think about life and had formed some fairly strong opinions on the world. He'd lost far too many friends for a man his age, and from where he sat, few, if any, of the politicians who sent young American men and women to war had ever served, or allowed their children to serve their country other than in positions that were nowhere near the front lines. In his opinion, there was just no excuse for a 20-year-long war. The man who'd been responsible for the Twin Towers was dead, and so were tens of thousands of his foot soldiers. It was time to stop fighting, and Cam promised himself he'd never fight again. Yet here he was, with murder in his heart, his mind roiling with rage over what had happened to his family, and no real way to deal with it other than the one thing he'd sworn off: killing. He'd never talked with his wife about what he'd really done on his deployments, and he shuddered now, thinking about all the faces he'd seen in the reticle of his scope. He hadn't killed everyone who'd passed in front of his rifle, but he'd pulled the trigger on a fair share of them. He knew the upcoming days would be like ripping a Band-Aid off a scabbed wound. It had to be done. He didn't want to do it, and he'd hoped he'd be the same man once his family was safely by his side again. He'd kept it all to himself after returning from the war, not wanting any of the ugliness from the combat to creep into their relationship. That was almost certainly going to change now. He'd done a pretty good job of it, keeping his temper in check, only drinking a beer or two, and only during a social gathering on a weekend. Jen was oblivious to his true struggle, believing her wonderful man had gallantly served his country just like in the movies and come home to marry the love of his life. Some of that was true, but not all of it. During his first year back, he'd go fishing just so he could cry alone along the edge of some high Sierra creek. After he purged the emotions, he'd drive home and resume a normal life as if nothing was going on in his head. Over time, he got a handle on his traumatized mind, and after having kids, the Middle East slowly dissipated like a dust cloud from an old truck on an older dirt road. Now, in less than 2 weeks, 10 years of healing was being erased, and it brought a sourness in his gut that nearly caused him to retch on the warehouse floor. "What's wrong?" The voice sounded distant, and for a moment he struggled to remember where he was. Darian stood in front of him, a look of concern on his face. "You okay, man?" Cam's mouth hung open, slack, and then he shook himself from his thoughts and nodded. "Yeah, I'm good to go." They stared at each other for a moment. "You good?" Cam asked, trying to level his position. Darian pursed his lips, his brows raised. "We heard you guys hammering them, but I don't think they even got a shot at us," he finally said. Cam rubbed at the stubble on his face, studying Darian. "You might want to stay here, Darian. What I'm about to do isn't something you can forget about. It won't be like hunting wild game." "I know." Cam pulled his hand from his face. "No, you don't know. I didn't know when I joined the Marines, but I know now. If you knew, you wouldn't be so eager to come with me." Darian licked his lips and smiled uncomfortably. "Like, what are you planning to do?" Cam stared bored into the younger Bayet man. "I'm going to kill. But that's not the bad part. It will be the way I do it and the things I do to their bodies. The savageness with which I conduct war out there will not be kind to anyone who's not 100% on board with what I'm doing, and what I'll ask you to do, if you come." Darian shifted his feet. "I'm not into any weird stuff like—" Cam's face darkened and he thrust a palm out. "Stop. Don't even say it. I'm not a sicko, but I'm willing to do whatever has to be done to retrieve my family. If that means decorating the trees with their men's body parts, so have a slight psychological edge, then by God, I'm going to decorate the trees. Darian crossed his arms, but gave a small nod. I may stake a man to the ground and slice him to ribbons until his screams draw in others from his unit so that I can kill them. Are you okay with that? Darian's face pinched in repugnance, but again he nodded. I'll get used to it, he muttered. Cam snorted. That's where you're wrong. After they left the warehouse, Cam and Darian moved west through the residential neighborhoods, creeping along the darkened streets, hoping to be outside the city limits by the time morning blossomed over the eastern horizon. They'd been walking for 3 hours before they broke into the open countryside. Even though the night was dark, Cam could tell the fields stretched to the base of the rolling hills, and farms dotted the flatter areas of the region. There wasn't much cover in the California hills other than the scrub brush and a few oaks that grew scattered across the landscape. This worried Cam when he considered their movement through the area after sunup. Once the sun lit up the rolling hills of Northern California, he called a halt to their expedition, wanting to assess their situation on the battlefield before proceeding. Although it was the United States of America and they were in the heart of California, he viewed it as a battleground and proceeded accordingly. They'd laid up in a clump of bushes several hundred yards from the road they'd paralleled, waiting and watching as darkness gave way to day and their surroundings came into clearer focus. Earlier, Cam steered them off the road, knowing there would be little chance of bumping up against a roving foot patrol that far out in the country. Walking the road, on the other hand, could have resulted in being driven up on, with no options other than to make a run for it across the open grasslands of the farms. The hills were nearly a half a mile in the distance, and they both would have been cut down before they'd made it more than a few yards into the open flatness of the terrain. The drawback was, the two heavily armed men walking around in the dead of night woke almost every farm dog in Sonoma County as they tracked across the open pastures. With no lights, they couldn't tell if a wary farmer had been awakened and lurked in the darkness with a rifle or shotgun. All they could do was push past the ruckus dogs and hope they stopped their barking sooner instead of later. Cam used a set of binoculars to scan in a 360-degree arc around their position. That took the better part of 20 minutes before he sniffed, withdrawing his eyes from the optics. I don't see anyone out and about, but it's still early. He glanced over at Darian, who continued to survey the landscape with a naked eye. I know a guy who lives out here, Darian said. He's really a friend of my dad, but Rostam and I know him. He's into those long-range radios. Maybe he'll have some news about your home state. A ham radio operator? Cam asked, leaning forward with interest. Darian shrugged. I guess. He's got a big-ass antenna on his barn and says he can talk to people in Europe if the weather is right. How far? Maybe another mile? Cam shot a look into the heavens, then wiped the back of his hand across his face. We stop, but only for half an hour, and then we're moving again. We don't have to stop. Cam shook his head. No, we should stop. Any news is good news. 10 minutes later, they crawled out of the depression they'd laid low in and made their way forward. 30 minutes later, Darian pointed at a modest white farmhouse set roughly 100 yards off the main road. Behind the house sat a barn that looked as though it may have been white at one time, but was now mostly bare wood. The driveway leading off the road to the house was gravel, as was the small parking area in front of the farmhouse. A porch stretched across the width of the home's front, with steps leading from the parking pad to the front door. A small table with 2 chairs was arranged on the porch to the left of the front door and looked as old as the ramshackle barn. When they were a couple of 100 yards out, Darian adjusted their angle of approach so they arrived in the front yard and not the back. When they were within 25 yards of the front porch, Darian held up a hand to let Cam know to stop. Mr. Foster, it's Darian Bayat, Pedram's son, he called out. Cam tried to look relaxed, assuming they were being scrutinized by an armed person from inside the farmhouse. His rifle hung at the low ready, with his hands resting easily atop the weapon's buttstock. A moment later, the curtains in the front window moved, but he couldn't see through the glass because of the home's darkened interior. Soon the front door eased open, and an older man who appeared to be in his late 70s appeared in the crack of the partially open door. "What do you want, Darian?" the man asked, his tone suspicious and full of raspiness brought on by a long life. Just looking for any news from around the country. My friend is from Tennessee and he's stranded. The door swung open and Mr. Foster stood in the opening holding a lever-action rifle and wearing Carhartt overalls. His eyes swept across Darian and Cam, then pushed out farther, as if searching for something he was worried would suddenly show up. "Get inside! It ain't safe to be out wandering around," the old man said with a wave of his bony hand. "You two scared the daylights out of the XYL, so get in here so she can meet you two." Mr. Foster turned and stood aside as Cam followed Darian up the stairs and inside, wondering what an XYL was. Mr. Foster was a fanatical ham operator, right down to how he talked to those who weren't. XYL was how he referred to his wife, or ex-young lady. "Well, come on," Mr. Foster prompted, turning and stalking deeper into the house. In the kitchen, Mrs. Foster stood with a short-barreled shotgun in hand and a worried look on her face. "Ma'am," Cam said as he entered the woman's domain. She regarded him coolly, a distrusting expression etched deeply into her aged features. "Hi, Mrs. Foster," Darian ventured. He got the same cold treatment. "Well, now that y'all know one another, let's go out to the barn," Mr. Foster said. He pushed past his wife and opened a back door that led outside. Halfway across the distance to the barn, Mr. Foster held a hand over his head and waved it dismissively. "Don't pay her no attention. She didn't trust anyone before all this mess started, and it's only made her worse." "Ain't that all of us?" Cam muttered, only half under his breath. That brought Mr. Foster's head around. "I think we're going to get along swimmingly, son."